Dr. Vanessa Moore had spent her entire adult life inside hospitals. From the moment she slipped into her first white coat at Johns Hopkins, medicine wasn't just her profession, it was her purpose. At 45, she was a seasoned internist and the head of ICU at one of Boston's busiest hospitals. Her name appeared on research papers, keynote speaker lineups, and awards for excellence in patient care. Colleagues respected her, residents admired her, patients trusted her. But behind the crisp lab coat and confident posture was a woman who believed in only what she could see, touch, and measure. Vanessa had no room for fairy tales, let alone God. In her world, life was biology, death was final, and anything unquantifiable belonged to the delusional or the desperate. Faith, she once scoffed to a medical student, is what people cling to when science fails them. It wasn't that she looked down on the religious, she simply found them irrational. Her father had been a Southern Baptist preacher, her mother a Sunday school teacher. But Vanessa had left that world behind at 17. After watching cancer eat away at her younger brother while their parents prayed night after night with no miracle in sight, she made a vow she would never waste another second believing in something that couldn't hold a scalpel or prescribe a solution. From that day on, she worshipped at the altar of science. Medicine became her gospel, her stethoscope, her crucifix. She worked brutal hours with mechanical precision, rarely taking time off. Holidays came and went like ordinary days. Friends and family often asked when she was going to slow down, find a partner, or start a family. But Vanessa had no interest in slowing. There were always more patients to treat, more charts to review, more lives to save. "I don't need anyone," she would say with a shrug. "I have a purpose." What no one saw was the toll that purpose was taking on her. Her once dark hair was now streaked with gray. The circles under her eyes deepened with each passing month. She survived on coffee, ibuprofen, and muscle memory. Even in her exhaustion, she remained sharp, composed, and deeply respected. But cracks were beginning to show. She started to forget small things. Her hands would tremble after long shifts. And though she never admitted it aloud, the walls of the hospital began to feel heavier. Still, she kept going. It was a bitter January night when the incident happened. The kind of night where the cold wind slithered down your collar no matter how tight your scarf. The ER had been flooded all day with flu cases, elderly fall injuries, and 2 back-to-back cardiac arrests. Vanessa had been on her feet for over 18 hours managing a chaotic ICU, short-staffed, due to a regional nurse shortage. Around 2:15 a.m., her lower back began to spasm, likely from bending over patients all night. She waved off the pain and asked a nurse to bring her a standard anti-inflammatory shot. It was something she'd taken before. Routine. Predictable. But this time, something went wrong. Within moments of the injection, Vanessa felt her throat tighten. Her vision blurred. Her skin turned clammy. She stumbled, knocking over a rolling cart as her knees buckled beneath her. A nurse screamed her name. Alarms blared. Doctors and staff rushed to her side. Her pulse vanished. Her lungs stopped drawing air. Just like that, the woman who had saved hundreds of lives died on the cold tile floor of the ICU hallway. Her death, clinically speaking, lasted 6 full minutes. But what happened during those 6 minutes would unravel everything she had ever believed. The first thing Vanessa noticed was the silence. Not the kind of silence that fills an empty room, but something deeper, like the entire world had been muted. There was no hum of monitors, no footsteps echoing down the ICU corridor, no voices calling codes or shuffling charts. Just silence, thick and absolute. Then slowly her vision returned, not as if she were opening her eyes, but as if reality were revealing itself, piece by piece. She saw the hospital floor, first polished tile beneath fluorescent lights. Then her own body sprawled awkwardly on the ground, face pale, lips bluish, motionless. People crowded around her, nurses shouting, a crash cart being wheeled in, a doctor pressing 2 fingers into her neck to check for a pulse. She recognized them all, her team, her friends, but their panic felt far away, like watching a movie through a pane of glass. She was floating. That was the only word for it. Suspended in the air above the chaos, untouched by pain or gravity. Her mind was alert, eerily clear, but her body was completely disconnected. Strangely, she wasn't afraid. Not yet. In fact, there was a strange calm, as if she had stepped out of time. But that calm didn't last. As her awareness expanded, she noticed something else. Something wrong. The hallway didn't look quite the same. The lights seemed dimmer, almost flickering. The corners of the ceiling looked darker than they should have, like soot creeping along the edges. There was a chill in the air, not physical exactly, but felt in the soul, a creeping cold that stirred something primal inside her. Then she saw movement. At first, she thought it was a shadow. Maybe someone turning the corner or a nurse adjusting equipment. But the way it moved, it wasn't human. It didn't walk. It slid, hovered. It was tall, too tall, and darker than shadow should be, an unnatural void that seemed to drink in the light around it. Vanessa blinked, certain it was a trick of the light. But when she opened her eyes again, it was still there. Standing in the far corner of the ICU, facing the bed of a patient she had just checked on an hour before. A man in his 60s, stable, recovering from pneumonia. The shadow bent toward him, not touching, not speaking, but somehow pressing its presence into him. The man stirred, whimpered, then flatlined. Vanessa felt a jolt of panic surge through her. What was that thing? And why could she see it? She turned, searching the ward, and her breath caught in her throat. If she'd had breath to lose. There were more. In every direction, figures drifted along the corridors, slipping in and out of patient rooms. Some hovered near bedsides, others lurked in corners. A few appeared to whisper, though no sound reached her ears, and wherever they lingered, the atmosphere changed. The air thickened. Patients began to twitch in their sleep. Machines beeped erratically. Several monitors flatlined almost in unison. Vanessa watched in horror as a nurse ran into a room, calling a code, blue, unaware of the shadowy figure gliding through the wall behind her. She wanted to scream, to warn them, but she had no voice, no mouth, no body. She was a witness, not a participant. And the more she saw, the more she realized how blind she and everyone else had been. These weren't hallucinations. They weren't tricks of oxygen-deprived neurons. This was something else. Something real. Then she noticed the difference. In some rooms there were no shadows. Instead there was light. Not the harsh white of hospital fluorescence, but a soft, warm glow, golden, comforting, powerful. And in that light stood figures too. But these weren't dark. They shimmered like fire through crystal forms, too bright to look at directly and yet somehow soothing. Angels, she realized. There was no other word. They stood like sentinels beside certain beds, arms folded, faces obscured by radiance, and wherever they stood, the shadows dared not enter. She drifted closer to one such room. An elderly woman lay unconscious, her breathing shallow, her family huddled beside her bed in prayer. Not elaborate prayers, not loud declarations, just a simple, trembling whisper. Lord, please be with her. And at those words, the angel seemed to shine even brighter, the shadows lurking in the hallway recoiling into the darkness. Vanessa turned, heart pounding in her spectral chest. The pattern was undeniable. Where there was prayer, where there was faith, the darkness could not stay. But where there was despair, where no one prayed, where no one believed, those were the places where the shadows fed. She suddenly thought of herself, her own body, her own soul. Was anyone praying for her who was standing between her and that same darkness she'd seen devour others? Panic rose in her like floodwaters. She began to search the room where her body lay. The team was still working chest compressions, epinephrine defibrillator. But there were no angels beside her. And in the far corner of the room, something darker than all the rest had begun to stir. It was watching her. Not her body, her spirit, her soul. And then it moved. The shadow that had been lurking in the corner of Vanessa's room now moved toward her with a slow, deliberate crawl. Its presence was oppressive, as if the very air in the room thickened, becoming heavier with each passing second. She felt it before she saw it, the weight of a presence that defied reason, something that existed outside of the realm of what she had ever understood. Every nerve in her spectral form tensed, yet there was no way to escape. Her body lay motionless, but her soul, her consciousness, was fully aware. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was as though the very force that bound her to this world was now being pulled away. The shadow stretched forward, long and dark, a swirling mass of nothingness. It had no face, no form, just a consuming void that seemed to drink in all the light around it, leaving only darkness in its wake. Vanessa felt a surge of terror, something primal deep within her, but it wasn't fear for her own body. It was fear for her soul. What if this was the end? What if this was how she was going to be claimed? As the shadow crept closer, Vanessa could feel its chill seep into her, a coldness that reached deep into her very core. It was like nothing she had ever experienced, colder than the harshest winter night, colder than the coldest operating room in the hospital. It wasn't just physical. It was the kind of cold that penetrated to the depths of one's spirit. A soul-freezing coldness that made her question everything she had believed in. In that moment, she was no longer a doctor. She wasn't the woman who had spent her entire life in the ICU, fighting to save lives, living by science, logic, and evidence. She was just a soul, lost in a world between life and death, and she realized with a sickening clarity that the battle for her soul was happening right now. Everything she had dismissed, everything she had ignored, was now in front of her, undeniable. The shadow drew closer still, its presence more suffocating now, wrapping around her like a shroud, tightening with each passing moment. She tried to pull away to fight, but there was nothing to fight with. She was powerless, trapped in the space between life and death, and the darkness was closing in. There was no escape, no place to hide. Then, just as Vanessa thought she could bear it no longer, the room erupted in light. It wasn't like the sterile fluorescent lights of the hospital. No, this light was alive, overwhelming in its intensity, yet comforting in its warmth. It flooded the room in an instant, pushing back the shadows, as if they were nothing more than smoke in the wind. Vanessa could feel the darkness recoil, retreating as the light grew brighter, stronger. And the shadow, this dark entity, hissed and writhed, twisting violently as though it were being burned by the very presence of the light. She tried to focus on the light to understand it, but it was impossible. The light was too pure, too magnificent to comprehend fully. And in the center of that light stood a figure, tall, strong, and radiant. His face was unseeable, bathed in brilliance, but the love, the power, the authority emanating from him was undeniable. It was as if he were everything she had ever longed for, everything she had ever doubted, everything she had ever needed. Vanessa. The voice came calm yet powerful, cutting through the chaos in the room. It was not a voice that could be mistaken for anything else. It was a voice that resonated deep within her, stirring something ancient and true. It is not your time. The words held a weight that was more than just a command. They were the very foundation of truth itself, like an anchor in a storm-tossed sea. And in that moment, Vanessa understood. She had spent her entire life searching for truth in numbers, in scans, in the human body. But this was the truth that transcended everything she had ever known. "You must return," the voice continued. "You must warn them." Vanessa felt the pull. It wasn't a physical pull, not like gravity or the tug of a string, but something deeper, more profound. The light around her intensified, and with it she felt herself being drawn back to her body, pulled against her will. It was as though the very fabric of her existence was being rewoven, her spirit yanked back into her form, like a thread pulled taut. The feeling was overwhelming, a mix of pain, confusion, and a deep aching longing to stay where she was, to remain in the light, to stay in the presence of something so pure, so holy, that everything she had ever known seemed insignificant by comparison. But she was being sent back, whether she wanted it or not. The light grew even brighter, and with a sudden jolt, she found herself back in her body, gasping for air, her chest heaving as if she had been drowning for years. The doctors around her shouted in disbelief, their faces filled with shock, as they watched her come back to life. "She's back," one of the nurses gasped, her voice shaking. "She's alive." Vanessa blinked rapidly, the world around her spinning. Her body felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. The sterile, cold ICU room felt suffocating now, even though she was alive. But as she lay there struggling to breathe, one thing was crystal clear in her mind. She had seen the truth. And the truth had sent her back with a mission. The light was real. The darkness was real. The battle for the soul was real. And Vanessa Moore, the woman who had spent her entire life believing that science held all the answers, now knew there was something far greater than medicine, far more powerful than any drug or procedure she had ever known. But there was also something far darker than she had ever imagined, and the battle was being fought every single day. And Vanessa was now part of it. The days following her return from the edge of eternity were a blur of lab coats, hushed voices, and lingering stares. Dr. Vanessa Moore lay in her hospital bed, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of monitors and beeping IV pumps. But nothing felt familiar anymore. Her colleagues were baffled. According to every scan chart and minute-by-minute readout, she should not have survived. 6 full minutes without oxygen to the brain, no pulse, no movement. And yet here she was, alive, coherent, breathing. But she wasn't the same. Not in the way that mattered. Vanessa hadn't just returned from clinical death. She had returned from a battlefield, one hidden in plain sight. And now she carried with her a weight that science couldn't quantify, and medicine couldn't heal. As she stared at the sterile ceiling tiles above her, images flashed through her mind in sharp detail. The shadows slithering across the hospital floors. The whispering demons leaning over unconscious patients. The radiant beings of light who stood guard like sentinels. She had spent decades believing the ICU was the last line of defense against death. But now she knew better. The true war wasn't against cardiac arrest or cancer. It was for the soul. And most people didn't even know they were in danger. She tried to push the memories aside, but they pressed in, like fog creeping through a cracked window. She remembered the room where the old man had died alone. No family, no prayer, just the hum of a machine marking time until it stopped. She'd seen the moment his soul was taken. Not guided, not lifted, but claimed, snatched away by something twisted and cruel. It had changed her. Vanessa had always prided herself on being composed, clinical, precise. Now even the simplest shift in air made her heart skip. Every time she passed an ICU room, she scanned the corners instinctively, her breath hitching if the shadows seemed too thick or the silence too still. She no longer trusted what her eyes alone could see. It wasn't long before the nightmares began. Not dreams, really, more like memories replaying themselves in the dark. In one, she watched herself floating again, unable to scream, as a demon wrapped itself around a patient writhing in pain. In another, she stood beside a nurse who whispered to a dying woman, "There's nothing more we can do," and saw the light vanish from the room the moment hope left her words. Vanessa would wake, drenched in sweat, the echo of Jesus' voice still ringing in her chest. "You must warn them." But how could she? She tried gently at first. She mentioned to a trusted colleague over coffee that she'd felt something strange during her time unconscious. The look on his face turned from curiosity to concern in a heartbeat. "You probably had a vivid hallucination," he said, sipping from his ceramic Boston Red Sox mug. "The brain's a tricky thing, especially when it's oxygen-starved." She nodded, pretending to agree, but inside something tightened. That wasn't just a hallucination. She had seen too much. Over the next few days, she tested the waters with others. A nurse who'd worked in hospice for 20 years admitted she'd sensed a presence in the room during certain deaths. Something heavy, dark, and cold. Another doctor, older and close to retirement, confessed quietly that he'd once seen a patient sit bolt upright moments before dying and scream, "They're here," before flatlining. "But we don't talk about that," he'd whispered. "If you value your license, you keep those stories to yourself." Vanessa understood the fear. The medical world wasn't built to make space for the spiritual. But that's exactly why the enemy was winning. She began noticing things she'd never paid attention to before. In one room, a woman with late-stage liver failure lay in near coma. Her son, no older than 25, sat beside her, reading softly from a Bible with frayed corners. The peace in that room was tangible. Vanessa felt it the moment she stepped inside. The air was warm. The hum of the machines was steady. There were no shadows, only light. 3 rooms down, another patient was dying alone. No visitors, no prayer. A television played quietly in the background, some infomercial peddling copper socks. The room was dim despite the overhead light. Vanessa saw the change in the air, the stillness, the heaviness, and felt the same pressure she'd felt when that first shadow had come for her. That's when she started praying. At first, it felt awkward. She didn't know what to say. But in the privacy of her office, she whispered under her breath before walking into certain rooms, "Lord, protect them. Send your angels. Don't let the darkness take them." She wasn't even sure if she believed all the words she said, but she knew deep down that they mattered. She felt the difference. One night, a patient in respiratory failure began to decline rapidly. The family had already stepped out to grab dinner. Vanessa, alone at the bedside, saw the fear in the woman's eyes, the kind of fear that goes beyond pain, beyond death. On instinct, Vanessa took her hand and whispered, "You're not alone. He's here. Just hold on." As she said the words, something shifted. The woman's breathing steadied. Her eyes closed, not in surrender, but in peace. She died 20 minutes later, but not afraid, not taken, just released. That was the moment Vanessa understood the power of standing in the gap. It wasn't about fixing the body anymore. It was about guarding the soul. Doctors might pronounce the time of death, but what happened in those final seconds mattered more than anything in a chart. Whether the person passed into light or darkness wasn't about their medical record. It was about whether someone had stood beside them, prayed over them, fought for them. The next morning, Vanessa began keeping a small prayer book in her coat pocket. She still treated patients. She still ordered tests, monitored labs, made rounds. But now she looked beyond the numbers. She asked families if they believed in prayer. She offered to pray with them if they were open. Many said yes. Some wept. A few politely declined. But always something changed in the atmosphere. Light came where it hadn't been before. She had been sent back for a reason. not to convince the world with arguments but to shine light where the shadows had claimed too much for too long. And she was just getting started. At first, Vanessa thought the resistance was simply social whispers in hallways, awkward glances in the break room, a few nurses walking away when she entered the lounge. Some of her closest colleagues, doctors she had trained side by side with through residency and grueling 24-hour shifts, now looked at her differently. Not with cruelty, but with quiet discomfort, like someone watching a beloved relative drift into something they didn't understand. At morning huddles, she noticed fewer people made eye contact. Invitations to after-hours consults stopped coming. Her rounds were still impeccable, her patients well managed, her diagnoses sharp, but the warmth was gone. She had become, as one of the residents put it with a nervous smile, the spiritual one. Still, she kept going. Vanessa didn't preach. She didn't hand out tracts or lecture on religion. All she did was pray quietly in her office. Speak softly to families about hope. Mention when asked that she believed there was something more than what the machines could measure. That life didn't end with a flat line. That death wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes she said it was what came after that people needed to be ready for. It was that word after that rattled people the most. Vanessa tried to be gentle, but the urgency never left her. She couldn't forget what she saw. The demons that whispered to the dying. The angels that stood guard where faith had been spoken aloud. The terrible moment when she, a respected doctor with a lifetime of accomplishments, had almost been claimed by the darkness simply because no one was praying for her. That memory stayed with her like a shadow under her skin. One evening, as she was preparing to leave after a 12-hour shift, a man in a dark navy suit stepped into her office. He wasn't wearing a hospital badge, and she hadn't seen him before. His hair was perfectly styled, his tie immaculately pressed, his face unreadable. Behind him stood another man, broader, silent, with a face like stone. "Dr. Moore," the suited man said with a smile too thin to trust, "we're here on behalf of hospital administration. Mind if we sit?" Vanessa hesitated, then nodded. The men sat down across from her, placing a leather folder on the edge of her desk. The suited one flipped it open slowly, revealing her own personnel file complete with physician performance reviews, disciplinary history which was blank, and a time-stamped incident report labeled, "Concerning behavior post-resuscitation." "We've received word," the man said, voice calm and clinical, "that you've been sharing unverified experiences with patients and staff. Conversations involving angels, demons, prayer, and life after death." Vanessa didn't flinch. "I haven't violated any policies. I don't push beliefs. I answer questions honestly. That's not against hospital ethics." "Technically, no." The man nodded, "But perception matters, Dr. Moore. You have a respected reputation. People listen to you. When you start talking about things that can't be proven, spiritual battles, supernatural visions, it creates concern." He closed the folder gently. "We're advising you to refrain from further discussion of your near-death experience in the hospital setting. For your own protection." "For my protection?" Vanessa asked, narrowing her eyes. The other man, who hadn't spoken, leaned forward slightly. "You're not the first, Dr. Moore," he said, his voice low and steady. "Others have tried to tell what they've seen. They didn't end well." A chill crawled up Vanessa's spine, not from the threat itself, but from the confirmation. They knew. They weren't just administrators or legal advisors. They were part of something much deeper and older. Vanessa met their gaze without blinking. "I'm not afraid," she said. "Then you haven't seen everything," the man replied quietly, and the two of them rose and walked out without another word. The next morning, her email was flooded with reminders of professional standards. One message from a colleague she'd known for years simply read, "Don't make it harder than it has to be." Another email from the medical board, vague but loaded, requested she meet with a peer review panel in 2 weeks. Suddenly, her perfectly clean record was under review. That night, Vanessa barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from the spiritual oppression that had begun to seep back into her life, like water under a door. In the quiet hours of 3:00 a.m., the same hour she had died, she felt the atmosphere shift in her home. The warmth of her bedroom turned cold. The lights flickered without cause. The air thickened. And once again she saw them, shadows not as bold as before, but present, watching. They didn't need to say anything. Their message was clear: stop. But she didn't. Instead, Vanessa began documenting everything. Every unusual death, every moment she sensed something unseen, every time a patient reported the man in the corner, or said, "They told me it was time," with no one else in the room. She kept records not for research journals, but for truth, for legacy, in case something happened to her. And something did. One late afternoon, she found herself in the palliative care ward visiting a patient whose family had stopped praying. The woman, riddled with late-stage cancer, was slipping quickly. Vanessa knelt beside her bed and whispered a soft prayer. Nothing loud, nothing formal, just truth. Suddenly the woman gasped, then opened her eyes wide and whispered, "I see them. Behind you." Vanessa turned slowly, and for the first time since her return, she saw not just the enemy, but the war. The room split open like a curtain. The physical world peeled back. Demons circled the hallway. Angels stood guard at 2 nearby rooms. But in this one there was a standoff. The woman's soul teetered. Vanessa prayed again, louder this time. "Jesus, come." And he did. Not in bodily form. Not like the time he met her in the light. But his presence swept through the room like a gust of wind from heaven's gates. The shadows shrieked and vanished. The woman exhaled one final time and smiled. Vanessa knew then she could never stop, even if she lost her job, even if they silenced her in meetings, questioned her in hearings, threatened her behind closed doors. Because this wasn't about reputation anymore. It was about eternity. And the world was too blind, too broken, and too distracted to see that the battle was already here. She had returned to fight. And she would not go quietly. Word travels fast in hospitals, especially when someone breaks the mold. And by now, Dr. Vanessa Moore had become more than just an anomaly. She was a storm system moving through the corridors of Boston General. Rumors swirled. The once hard-nosed internist who used to laugh off chaplains and prayer circles was now speaking at churches, praying over dying patients and talking about angels and demons like they were part of her clinical rounds. The administration wasn't thrilled. Her professional peers were split down the middle. Some avoided her entirely. Others leaned in close when no one was around and asked, "What exactly did you see?" But the one group that leaned in the hardest, with hearts wide open and eyes filled with tears, were the families of the dying. They came quietly at first. One woman approached her at the end of her shift, clutching a worn photo of her late husband. "He died last year. Alone," she whispered. "But if what you say is true, I wish someone had prayed for him." A father in his 70s stopped her in the hospital lobby, tears in his eyes. "I used to think prayer didn't matter," he said, voice trembling. Now I pray every night for my wife in room 622. Do you think it's enough?" Vanessa didn't have easy answers, but she did know one thing. It was never too late to begin. Word reached local churches. First, a small, non-denominational congregation in South Boston invited her to speak. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready. What if they thought she was crazy? But as she stood at the pulpit looking into the eyes of men and women old enough to be her parents, some gripping oxygen tanks, others holding photos of children lost, she knew this was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't read from notes. She didn't prepare a slideshow. She just told them what happened. She told them about the injection, the allergic reaction, and the 6 minutes she was gone. She told them how she floated above her body and saw creatures no medical textbook had ever prepared her for, beings that fed on despair, that waited in the corners of ICU rooms like vultures, waiting for a soul to give up. She told them how some of those creatures whispered lies into the ears of the dying, lies so cruel they could only have come from hell. But she also told them the truth about the light, the brilliant, unshakable light that burst through the darkness. She told them about Jesus and how his voice didn't thunder or tremble the walls, but instead cut through fear like a scalpel through infection. When she finished, the sanctuary was silent. Not because no one believed her, but because many did. And it shook them. From that night on, Vanessa's story began to spread beyond the walls of the hospital. A retired pastor who'd been in the audience invited her to speak at his senior prayer group at a community center in Roxbury. A woman in her late 60s who worked part-time as a hospital chaplain shared Vanessa's testimony with her daughter, who ran a Christian podcast. Within 2 weeks, Vanessa was speaking on air to tens of thousands of listeners across the U.S., and the letters started pouring in. One came from a nurse in Tampa, Dr. Moore. I've seen them too. I thought I was going crazy. Thank you for making me feel sane again. Another came from a man in Missouri whose father had recently passed. We didn't pray. We just let go. I can't stop wondering what might have happened if someone had just said the name of Jesus. Thank you for waking us up. One day, a frail woman in her 80s asked to speak with Vanessa before her final dialysis session. Her voice was shaky, but her eyes held a fierce clarity. I used to pray every day when I was younger, she said, but after my son died, I stopped. I was angry, bitter. But last night I saw him in a dream, and he told me to listen to you. So I'm here, and I want to pray again. Vanessa didn't always know what to say in those moments. She wasn't a pastor, wasn't trained in theology. She was still learning how to navigate this new life, 1 foot in the hospital, 1 foot in the supernatural. But what she lacked in doctrine, she made up for in conviction. She had seen the battle, and now she carried the urgency of a soldier who knew the war was real. But the darkness hadn't given up. One night, driving home after a late shift and a church meeting, Vanessa noticed her headlights flicker. Her car, a dependable Ford Explorer she'd driven for nearly 10 years, began to sputter. She pulled over on a quiet stretch of road outside of Dedham. The engine cut off completely. No lights, no sounds, only the thick silence of a rural night. And then she saw them. Not with her eyes, but with something deeper. Figures along the tree line shifting, watching. No faces, just hunger. Vanessa gripped the steering wheel and whispered, "Jesus." Light exploded across her dashboard as the ignition suddenly roared back to life. The headlights flared so brightly they lit up the road in both directions. The figures vanished. She drove home shaking but resolved. The enemy was real, and it hated that she was talking. The next day she bought a cheap camcorder and started recording short testimonies in her living room. No fancy editing, no special effects, just her speaking, plainly, softly, urgently. She uploaded them to a video platform under the title "A Doctor's Warning: What I Saw When I Died." Within a month, her first video had nearly 1 million views. Some called her delusional, some accused her of chasing fame, but thousands more left comments like, "This is the confirmation I needed. I've been in healthcare 40 years. I've seen what you're describing. Thank you, Dr. Moore. I'm praying again." She started traveling small towns, nursing homes, veterans halls, retirement communities, anywhere people were willing to listen. She spoke at a VFW in Kansas City where a 92-year-old former Marine wept and whispered, "I haven't prayed since Vietnam, but I don't want to go into the dark alone." That's when she knew this mission wasn't just for the patients. It was for everyone. The elderly widow, the skeptical nurse, the exhausted son, holding his mother's hand in hospice. Everyone needed to know that death was not the end, and that there were forces fighting for every soul. Vanessa had once believed her scalpel was the most powerful thing she could wield, but now she knew better. It was prayer, it was faith, and it was the name of Jesus. And as long as she had breath, she would keep speaking that name. Because the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The final test didn't come with a flashing monitor, a boardroom confrontation, or a demonic whisper in the night. It came on a quiet Thursday morning in early spring, the kind of day when the sun streams through hospital windows and fools people into thinking everything is fine. Vanessa had just finished rounds, her steps slower now but still purposeful, when she was paged urgently to room 508. No code, just an urgent request. That room belonged to Mr. Albert Jenkins, a World War II veteran in his late 90s who had outlived every family member, every friend, and according to his own gruff jokes, most of his enemies. He was stubborn, proud, and fiercely independent. Vanessa had cared for him off and on for 2 years. As she entered the room, she immediately sensed the shift in the atmosphere. The light felt dimmer than it should have been. The air was heavier, tighter. Mr. Jenkins was sitting up in bed, more alert than usual, his eyes locked on a darkened corner of the room. "There's something in here with me," he rasped. "And it ain't one of your angels." Vanessa's stomach dropped. She moved closer, checking his vitals. His heart rate was erratic, blood pressure climbing. He was pale and clammy, but conscious, lucid even. She sat beside him, placing a hand on his trembling wrist. "You're not alone, Mr. Jenkins. I'm here. And so is he." He swallowed hard. "I ain't prayed since I buried my wife in '76, he muttered. "I thought I'd made peace with it. But now I don't know." Vanessa didn't hesitate. She'd faced these moments before, plenty of times now, but this one felt different. The air pressed in like a storm cloud ready to burst. Something was waiting. "Albert," she said softly, "you don't have to fix everything. You just have to say his name." Tears welled in his weary eyes. "I don't remember how." "I'll help you." They prayed together. It wasn't fancy. No King James language. Just an old man and a once skeptical doctor whispering a final surrender. "Jesus, I'm sorry. I believe. Take me home." And then, as Vanessa closed her eyes and whispered amen, the lights in the room flickered and everything shifted. She saw them again, just like before. One final time. But this time she wasn't out of her body. She was in it, fully present, fully alive, yet still fully aware. The veil had lifted. A figure of light stood at the foot of the bed, an angel radiant and still. Behind him a shadow moved, retreating, defeated. And then Mr. Jenkins exhaled his last breath with a peace that made the whole room still. Vanessa felt it in her bones. He hadn't been taken. He had been received. She stood up slowly, tears in her eyes, not of grief, but of reverence. She had seen many people die over the years, but this one felt holy. But just as she turned to leave, something surged through her chest, a sharp, stabbing pain that took her to her knees. Her breath caught, her vision blurred. The monitors in the hallway behind her started beeping wildly. She clutched the bed rail, gasping. A nurse rushed in. Dr. Moore. Vanessa collapsed. She was gone before she hit the floor. But this time there was no floating, no shadows, no whispering demons, only light, pure, blinding light. And standing in the center of it, smiling, waiting, was Jesus. "You did it," he said. Vanessa fell to her knees, her soul finally home. She had fought well, spoken truth, held the hands of the dying, battled the darkness not with degrees or data, but with faith, prayer, and love. "You were faithful with little," Jesus said, reaching for her hand. "Now enter into your reward." And just like that, the pain, the pressure, the noise of earth, it faded. But her story didn't end. Back at the hospital, her death sent ripples through the staff. Doctors and nurses who had once rolled their eyes now stood quietly in the hallway, remembering the woman who used to pray for every patient, whether they asked or not. A chaplain found the worn prayer book in her coat pocket, still open to a dog-eared page marked with a sticky note, "Never let them die alone." The hospital set up a memorial service in the chapel. Hundreds came, patients, former families, even strangers who had only seen her online. A man in a wheelchair who had once mocked her video sat in the back pew, weeping, whispering the name Jesus over and over. Her videos continued to spread. Her story was retold across the country, from Baptist churches in Tennessee to nursing homes in Utah. Her testimony was printed in newsletters, played in hospital devotionals, and watched in quiet bedrooms where children sat by the beds of dying parents. A small foundation was started in her name, dedicated to spiritual care in end-of-life settings. It was called the Moore Light Project. And something else began to change. Doctors began to pause before pronouncing time of death. Nurses began praying under their breath during resuscitations. Families began holding hands even in sterile rooms, whispering, "You're not alone. He's here." Because one woman dared to tell the truth, because she'd seen what comes after, and because she had refused to stay silent. The battle for the soul was real. But thanks to Dr. Vanessa Moore, fewer would go into it unaware, and far fewer would go into it alone. The story of Dr. Vanessa Moore delivers a profound and sobering message that life and death are not merely medical events, but deeply spiritual moments that carry eternal weight. For years, Vanessa trusted only in science, dismissing anything beyond the physical. But when she died and was brought back, she was shown a terrifying truth. There is a war being waged over every soul, and most people are unaware, unprepared, and unprotected. Her journey reminds us that faith matters not just in times of comfort, but especially at the edge of life. Prayer isn't a last resort. It is a weapon, a shield, a lifeline between heaven and earth. For those in their later years, this story is a call to remember what truly lasts. It urges us to keep praying for our loved ones, to stand in the gap for those who are weak, and to never assume someone is beyond hope. In a world that often downplays the spiritual, Vanessa's testimony wakes us up. Eternity is real. And what we do in our final moments, and what others do on our behalf, can change everything. Never stop believing. Never stop praying. Because sometimes one whispered prayer is all it takes to bring light into the darkness.